Welcome everyone to our first Longevity Tonic webinar of 2022. The Longevity Forum was founded 3 years ago by Jim Mellon, Dafina Gropsy-Penny, and Andrew Scott. In addition to the forum's focus on economics, health, and science, living a longer life means more time for education, more time for travel, and more time for internal growth. This brings us to today's webinar on the Via Franais, an ancient pilgrimage from Canterbury to Rome. Father Michael has been a wonderful contributor to the Longevity Forum, and we had the pleasure of him joining us in person in London at Longevity Week this year in November. Father Michael studied at University College Dublin, where he focused on Greek and Roman civilization, history, and philosophy. He was ordained a Catholic priest at Holy Cross in Clonliffe in 1985. Father Michael later lived in Rome and taught at several universities. He also attended postgraduate school at the Pontifical Institute of Christian Archaeology in Rome. He has written many books on art history, as well as biographical works on Pope Francis, Pope Benedict, and Pope John Paul. Now, before I hand the microphone over to Father Michael, please remember, we love questions. So please just post in the chat room here any questions or comments you have, and Father Michael and I will get to them after the presentation. Now to you, Father Michael.
Thank you very much, Laura. Over the last few webinars, we've been following the paths of our ancestors. And today we're going to follow one of the most ancient pilgrimage and Roman roads. A lot of people know about the Via of Santiago, the Camino of Santiago, the way that leads from various parts of Europe over to the west into Spain to the shrine of St. James the Apostle, which was discovered according to tradition in the 9th century. But today we want to travel on a different road, which is in actual fact much older than the road of St. James. And this is called the Via Franais. It literally means in kind of distorted Latin come French, the French way or the French road. And traditionally, the Via Franais went from Canterbury in England, in the southeast of England, across the English Sea, the Channel, into France, and then down through France, across the Alps, the Italian Alps, and then into the Italian peninsula and on down towards Rome. And some of the pilgrims later on would continue on into what we call the Holy Land, Israel and Palestine. So today's trip is going to be a journey along the Via Franais. So the Via Franais, the old French road, is roughly between 1,700 and 2,000 kilometers, more or less, following the old Roman road. One of the consular roads, the several consular roads, the Via Cassia, which was constructed sometime after 187 before Christ. So that means that road itself is already over 2,000 years old. And the Roman roads were all constructed originally for the armies. It wasn't to allow trade or to allow people to travel with greater ease. The whole concept of the roads for the Romans was to allow the armies to travel rapidly, quickly, efficiently, get the resources, have stages where they could change horses, where they could get munitions, where they could get food and supplies, etc. So that was the whole idea. And that actually is one of the great success stories and explains as a key moment in the Roman Empire to understand why they were so successful. It all boils down to cobblestones. So the Via Franais, which we're going to cover today, at least in part to get us across the Alps, started traditionally in Canterbury, which was originally, as we saw in our last meeting, the place where Augustine of Canterbury, who was sent by Pope Gregory the Great at the beginning of the 7th century, or perhaps the late 6th century, the 590s, he set up his see, his cathedral, his headquarters, if you like, in southern Anglia. And this then became an important part of the church, which is established, the Christian church, which is established in Anglia. And it became more famous, of course, with the famous Archbishop Thomas à Becket, who in the 12th century was killed on perhaps the suggestion of the English king, not perhaps direct orders. But the pilgrims traveled over, they crossed the sea, and they went from usually Dover or Southampton or Portsmouth, and they traveled over sometimes to Dunkirk, sometimes to Dieppe, sometimes to Calais, and they arrived over in Gaul, in the Frankish land, and then they made their way southwards. The pilgrims very often went to Paris in order to sail down the Loire. By this stage, the Roman Empire in the West had collapsed in the 5th century. The roads were no longer as safe as they had been, and people tried to travel by water, by river, by sea as much as possible. The Great Barrier were the Alps, and these really were impassable. Talk to Hannibal, for example. These were impassable during the winter months. So usually people waited until the spring, until the snows had in some place melted, so they could pass, the most famous being the St. Bernard Pass, they could pass safely across the mountain gaps. As we've seen in our meetings before, people either traveled in groups, a small handful, or in larger clusters. And that was all for security reasons. They carried very little with them: a staff, a satchel, and a wide-brimmed hat to protect them from the elements. And passing across into Italy or to Switzerland, they arrived then in a different area geographically. Food was different, the plains were different, everything was a contrast to what they'd experienced from the north of Europe. So when we look at the roads today, and I've been lucky enough to travel a large part of the Via Francigena on foot, when we look at it today, it's somewhat barren, and contrast this with, for example, the Camino of Santiago in Spain, because over 250,000 people travel that every single year, and that number is growing year by year. And then contrast this with the Via Francigena, which, as I mentioned to you, dates back at least as a pilgrim route to the 6th century. And we certainly have an 8th century description of pilgrims going up and down this road. But unfortunately, today, the road is virtually abandoned. So if you've done the Via of Santiago, if you've been to Spain and you want to do somewhere, I'd argue even more beautiful, but I have to be careful what I say, this is a fantastic road to take. Now, one of the people who gave us an idea of the route is a man called Sigeric the Serious, and I'm serious, that was his name. Sigeric, or maybe a nickname, Sigeric was the Archbishop of Canterbury. And at the end of the 10th century, he had to travel to Rome in order to collect a garment for his office when he'd been appointed from the Abbey of Glastonbury to be the Archbishop of Canterbury. So around 900 or 89 or 90, Sigeric travelled across the English Channel into France, down through France, over the Alps. And this was in the summer. We know this. He wanted to arrive for the 29th of June in order to participate in the ceremonies for the feast of St. Peter and Paul, which was held and celebrated on that day. And extraordinarily, This sounds almost unbelievable. But after 2 days in Rome, he turned back and wound his way upwards, northwards, back to Canterbury. Now, why he didn't stay for a few days and enjoy the food and the wine, I've no idea. Maybe they hadn't got ice cream in those days, but nevertheless, he was obviously a very serious man, and he went home pretty quickly. But he did leave us with an account of the journey, and it mentions about 40 stages or stops in which he traveled, and these included various villages, towns, cities. And he then wrote this account, so it doesn't give us much information, but at least we know the places that he traveled. There wasn't any one particular Via Francigena, because you could have deviations, and over the history of maybe 400 or 500 years, various towns and areas got involved in wars and disputes. So therefore, pilgrims would maybe avoid one area which was at war in order to pass through a more tranquil area. But usually a pilgrim, when they went, they had a few purposes. One was they wanted to go and pray at a holy shrine, a holy site. Well, that's what many people do if they belong to a religious tradition. They go to somewhere which is iconic or important in their faith. Some Christians would have been punished and told to go on pilgrimage to Canterbury or to Rome for perhaps murdering somebody or committing some heinous crime, and that therefore would be restitution of some description. So therefore, when they set out, they had to have a public ceremony in which they received a satchel and a staff. And here we have the bishop in a medieval manuscript blessing the satchel and the staff. So then the pilgrims would set out. It was generally, as we've mentioned before in our meetings, generally a man's pilgrimage. This was a man's world, of course, in those days. And women were able to join, but it was very much a minority. And you will find that the vast majority of people were men who were free to travel. Very rarely would you find the firstborn of a family traveling, because he was at home minding the farm, the estate, running the business, etc. Because at that time we had the law of primogeniture, which meant that the firstborn inherited a lot. And then as you went down through the family, the younger people in actual fact had a lot more freedom. They may not have had the same income, but they had a little bit more freedom. The pilgrims were very easy to recognize on the road. Some of them wore the scallop shell, which indicated that they were on the way or they had completed their journey to Santiago in Spain. But they were always identified by the staff, the satchel, and then maybe a little insignia, which they would wear on their cloak or on their hat. And on our left-hand side, we've got an image of St. Thomas of Canterbury in a lead seal, and this was like a badge. It was almost a souvenir that people would purchase or be given once they arrived in a particular place. And then another leaden seal which indicates the scallop shell of St. James. And on our right-hand side, we have our pilgrims making their way through, and one poor man has obviously had an accident and his leg is bandaged and he looks quite uncomfortable, but nevertheless, it reminds us of the arduous conditions which many of these people had to endure as they traveled along their pilgrim path. Most people probably had to walk, but those who were wealthy could hire a mule or a horse and travel from place to place. It's been estimated that people traveled around 20 kilometers or so per day by foot, but obviously on a horse you could do a little bit more, but not much more, because horses are, I was going to say horses are human, but horses are animals and we can't push them too far. If there was a group, perhaps they would hire a coach like this, but again, you ought to have money, and we're living in relative prosperity compared to people in the Middle Ages. And therefore, the idea of being able to hire a cart or a passage in a cart, even for part of the journey, was something that not everybody could do. And interestingly, The coach that we're looking at is a reconstruction of medieval coach, a repaired coach, but it's more or less the same type of coach that the Romans had from the 5th century. So between the 5th century and I would say almost the 15th century, these coaches barely developed. And it was only in the 16th century, with the invention of the chassis, the sprung chassis, and of the brake, that we find transport becoming a little bit more comfortable. Georges de la Tour has given us this painting of St. James the Greater, connected with Santiago, but look at the gourd in which he kept his water. That was your water jar, and then the staff and the cap, and also a mantle. The mantle was another way of indicating to people that you were on pilgrimage. But you had to be careful because you didn't want to alert the local thieves what you were up to. Scaling the St. Bernard Pass, or another lower area in which to travel through the Alps, one descended into the Italian peninsula. Italy, of course, wasn't a country at that stage. It was a series of republics, of duchies, of kingdoms. But it held one thing that many people wanted to go to, and that was the great city of Rome. That was their goal. And look at the marvelous countryside through which they traveled. So there was a veritable explosion of colours, of sounds, of smells with which the pilgrims from the north of Europe, from Germany, Poland, France, England, Ireland, would be unfamiliar. But when they made their journey down, they were entering into a whole new experience. And I want to stop in the city of Siena. Now, Siena and Florence both go together in the same breath, and they're both rivals. And to a large degree, Florence was the successful big sister, because when they had a row, Florence always won, and they were always rowing. Siena, on the other hand, always seemed to lose and have to pay a ransom, or they had to restitute money to the Florentines. So therefore, the Florentines were able to load their money into the banking system, into patronizing art and buildings, etc. But the Sienese didn't. And when you go to Florence and Siena, you'll see the two cities are rather different in shape and form. They were both Roman foundations. Florence was able to make itself more beautiful, more up-to-date by employing the great architects of the day. But Siena, not having enough money, remained a slightly old-fashioned city. And for that reason, in Florence, we'll see the rebirth of classical antiquity modeled on ancient Rome. But in poor old Siena, we're going to find the Gothic arches, we're going to find the boring old brick facades. But nevertheless, inside, the Sienese shared the great artists of Florence, of Lombardy, and of France. Now, here we've come into the Hospitale of Santa Maria alla Scala, and it lies directly in front of the cathedral of the city of Siena. And it was founded in order to fulfill a few purposes. First of all, because it was on the Via Franais, it was a hostel where the pilgrims could rest for the night. They could come, find a bed, and carry on the next day. Meals were served 3 times a day, so I should say 3 times a week. So if they hit the right day, they got their food. If they were injured or if they had any difficulties or health or medical problems, then they could see a doctor. And it's fascinating to see all of this recorded on the walls of the Hospitale, which is variously described as a hostel, a place where people can rest, sleep for a few days, but it also served as an orphanage. And again, we're talking about a slightly different world. On the Via Francigena, there were many people traveling along the road, and you don't need me to explain how often somebody could become pregnant unintentionally, unexpectedly, and therefore they'd nothing to do except carry the baby. Where could they go? Sometimes they would want to take the baby. And curiously, here's the thing which I only discovered quite recently. I never knew before, that in the medieval world, the idea was not to take children and separate them from their parents forever. The idea was to take the child, keep a record of the child in the hopes that, a bit like going to the bank and redeeming a loan, the parents or parent could come back and claim the child. And for that reason, children were given a brand, an ink mark on their arms, their legs, or whatever. Or very often they would be given a small piece of cloth or a garment if the person was poor, couldn't afford anything else. And that was the token which they then would come back to the hospital after a few months or years to redeem their child. Now, it didn't always happen like that. There weren't always happy endings, but it did mean that sometimes people could do that. And when I was in Santa Maria alla Scala, I saw a little book, a ledger book, which was filled with small pieces of rags and cloth, which had been torn. And obviously they were brought back by a parent who hoped to unite the two pieces of cloth to prove that she or he was the parent. Now, the hospital itself was run independently of the church, even though it had probably been founded as a religious institution, but it nevertheless became very important. And again, we're on the Via Francigena, and that is an ancient Roman road, so it's an ancient trade road. But by the time the pilgrims are going up and down, they are also bringing their pennies, and they're dropping their pennies into the churches as they make their way. That's what churches seem to do best, collecting pennies, collecting money. And therefore, they put all of the money into the embellishment of these hospices, hostels, where people could be looked after and cared for. And looking at these frescoes, we have a glimpse into life in the early part and the mid 15th century. So the room that we're looking at was built probably in about 1328 to 1330. And here we have the rector receiving a poor beggar man and clothing him. And obviously there's been a big patch of restoration has gone on in the middle. The rector is represented in his brown cloak, dressed quite simply, but we're going to see in a moment the magnificent clothes that the other supporters and members of the guild wore. And these frescoes, of course, introduce us into the medieval world and show us things that we could not imagine. It's almost, just think, this is the time before the invention of photography, before the internet, before television, the cine camera, the iPhone. This is a snapshot into the later medieval world as it turns the corner into the Renaissance. And so we've an idea of, if we study these images, we have an idea of what life was like. And again, you'll notice that the architecture style is quite old-fashioned, whereas Siena was remaining within the Gothic grasp of architecture in its pointed arches, in its slender columns, etc. Florence, meanwhile, had gone forward in order to go backwards, because Florence had embraced the classical rebirth of Rome through such great architects as Michelangelo, as Bramante, Raphael, Leonardo da Vinci, all of whom had spent time in Florence. These frescoes in Santa Maria alla Scala, which were restored a few years ago, are a precious insight into the world which is virtually disappeared. The frescoes were largely created by the studio of Ambrogio di Marsiglia, Ambrose of Marseille, and a reminder, of course, you had the great names of Lorenzetti, Ambrogio, Simone Martini, all of whom were working at this period. And these were the great names of that day. And they would have remained the greatest names in history had they not been eclipsed later on by Leonardo da Vinci, by Michelangelo, and by Raphael. So these are frescoes extraordinarily. They're made with sand and lime, which is mixed together with water, plastered on the wall. And as the plaster is drying, it's only barely a millimeter thick, the paintbrush is applied with the different pigments, the sketch is made, and then the painting is laid out on the wall. And extraordinarily, because the colors travel in, the pigments travel into the drying plaster, they solidify and they remain in the plaster itself. So they're not actually on the surface. So when you go to repair or to clean a fresco, in actual fact, you don't have a great amount of work to do apart from taking off the overlay of soot, smoke, and grime. These frescoes are marvelous because they also give us an insight into how people lived in those days. And we find here's a poor man lying in bed. He doesn't look well at all. One of the friars is listening to him, perhaps trying to give a word of comfort, although he doesn't look that terribly interested. Or maybe he's just very pensive, who are we to judge? And here is the man who's clearly dying. He's laid on the ground, and one of the attendants is leaning towards him in order to help him in his pain. Notice both the expression on the man who is suffering and also his gestures with his hands. And then notice, interestingly, the foreshortening of the face of the man who's leaning towards him, because this was made at the very, very beginning of the perspective of foreshortening. Another young man obviously has been through the wars and he's got a gash on his thigh, and he's been attended by one of the people in the hospice. He's probably had his wounds tended and cleaned. Look even at the attention to the cushion. And curiously, there's no blood on the cushion, so they obviously did a very good job here. Also, I want to draw your attention to the painting of the glass jug. Very often, urine was examined because that was one of the ways that the doctors of the period were able to work out whether you had a disease, an infection, etc., etc. Something indeed which is still practiced in medicine today, but in a slightly more sophisticated manner. But look at the glass. That is plaster, colours just painted on with a brush on damp plaster, allowed to dry. And then just before the plaster is completely dried, just a few deft brushes have been added to show the reflections of the light coming from outside. It's extraordinary to think that this is completely a flat surface. And again, this is something which is so realistic. The cat and the dog have obviously met and decided they don't like each other, and they're about to face off for their territory. And then also look on our right-hand side, the gentleman has a very elegant sandal or shoe. That must have been all the rage in 15th century Siena, but I don't think they make them anymore. And then we come to our final fresco, which again is a magnificent fresco. Look at the mastery of perspective, of color, the explosion of color that is here. And just think that this was all done for the people who were passing through Siena, maybe for a rest as they continued on their way to Rome, maybe to have a child, maybe to give up the child, even just to find a change of clothes. So this was a place of charity. And look at the magnificence with which they wanted to decorate their building. And incidentally, both men and women were looked after separately. In other words, there's a refectory for women, a refectory for men. There's a dormitory for women and a dormitory for men. And obviously then a place where the births, where the babies were delivered. And here we have a little intimate scene of the children in the playgroup. And we see the children at breast. We find some of the women trying to teach the children, but they've obviously found a master who holds a rod, and he's teaching a little girl, it seems, her lessons. And then in the corner on the right-hand side, we have a couple of books and some writing instruments. You see a quill and an inkhorn just underneath the books. Up in the gallery, some women are playing, entertaining the group. One girl is playing a harp, another tambourine. And it's around this time, incidentally, that we begin to have our first written music, the Ars Nova. It was at this stage that musicians were beginning polyphony, beginning new sounds in music, and they were writing down in their own language, in their own vernacular. They were writing down their songs in French, in Italian, in German, in Spanish, etc. So it's only from this period that we actually know what the music sounded like, and we have instruments which have survived, fortunately, from which we can make replicas. And over on the right-hand side, it appears that the rector is handing out a child, or a woman is handing her child to the rector to be taken into care. We don't know, so we have to try and interpret that as best we can. And in our final image, before we leave, I've just chosen this wonderful, almost comic expression of a woman who's been fanning the flames, and you see the wisps of smoke which are rising from the chimney breast. And because the smoke is getting in her eyes, she has to close one of her eyes, and she looks plaintively back at us, at the audience, at the onlookers, as if to say, can you please get me out of here? And meanwhile, on the right-hand side, another lady has come into the scene, and she's offering us some bread. And that will be important as we continue our journey, because when the next time we meet, we'll be taking the road out of Siena, continuing down through Tuscany. Maybe the next time I think we probably should examine some of the typical food of the era and of the area. And then we'll carry on into Rome, which was the goal of the visit of so many people.
Thank you so much, Father Michael. That was quite a journey, and I just can't believe those frescoes. What beautiful masterpieces.
They're marvelous, aren't they? Yes, I'm looking forward to making a trip back to Siena later this year. Hopefully, fingers crossed.
Yes, let's hope so. Now we have some great questions from the audience. Let me just pull these up. Okay. So first question is, how did pilgrims finance their journeys, and did they return by boat?
Very interesting question. Well, first of all, this seemed to have been an undertaking which was made across all strata of society. So either people had family money or they had resources of their own. But those who didn't, they were able to go from place to place. And in particular, many of them, as they were on a pilgrimage, if they were carrying the badge, which I mentioned a moment ago, they were able to present themselves at a hostel or someplace where they would get some food and somewhere to rest. And that generally was free. And if they wanted to make a contribution, they could, but these were generally free. And they themselves were paid for very often by wealthy patrons or bequests. And in the past, people always made a bequest of money, including a religious or a charitable institution.
Interesting. So I have another follow-up question to that is, what professions would most of the pilgrims be? Would they be merchants, farmers?
Well, another very interesting question. I think it was just about everybody, because if you read the accounts of the medieval pilgrim route, going to Santiago, going to Rome, obviously, and Canterbury and other places like that, you'll find just about everybody. And a good example of this, we've already done Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, and we've seen the various people, and they definitely were from all strata of society. So I would say from rich to poor, from young to old, they were all on the road.
Great. And well, here's a pretty simple question. How long did this journey take?
Well, I suppose it depended where you were starting off from, but let's say you were starting from Paris. Just Paris was one of the popular cities, and the reason for that was because you could sail down the Loire, and that took off several days from your journey. Because remember, I mentioned that most people either walked or took a cart or went by mule or horseback. But if you could take a boat going down, that would give you some distance. And then you could relax on the boat, and then certainly you could cover a few hundred miles along that way, a few hundred kilometers. So I suppose in answer to your question, if you're walking and making the pilgrim route coming from England, let's say, over to Paris and then down, it certainly would take you 2 to 3 months. And going back, yes, again, if the boat was a possibility. And curiously, a lot of people would embark at the port of Rome, Civitavecchia, and they would sail across the Mediterranean if they wanted, let's say, to go back to Spain, or they wanted to make a pilgrimage to Santiago, etc. So certainly there was quite a lot of boat travel, which we tend to overlook.
Wonderful. And you mentioned people coming from Paris as being very common, but were there also pilgrims that came from the south?
Oh, yes, there were, of course. There would have been people coming from Greece, Turkey, Malta, North Africa, and then, of course, the southern part of the Italian peninsula. Yes, because Rome was the great draw. And in fact, on our next webinar, we're going to be going into the city of Rome itself. So we've got a pretty good idea of why it was such an attractive destination.
And I look forward to that one, especially with your history in Rome. And then also, we have another question. Did people continue on past Rome after the pilgrimage?
Yes, actually, we know that they carried on. There was 2 more pilgrim sites down in, one was in the Gargano. It was a shrine where it was believed that the Archangel Michael had appeared, and people of all religions and of none are obsessed by angels. So that was a very popular pilgrim route. But of course, if you went over to Bari, you could cross over into Greece, and you could also make your way down into Palestine, and you could carry on and get full value by going to Jerusalem. So you could do a lot, bits of everything.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much again, Father Michael. And we're very much looking forward to your next webinar, especially after the many years you've spent in Rome at the Vatican. So we will be back in a few weeks. So please stay tuned to our website, thelongevityforum.com, or our Twitter, longevity_forum. And on our next webinar, we will be going past the gates to the eternal city of Rome. Thank you again, Father Michael.
Pleasure. See you soon.